Today is your master guide to find the best sensitivity for you on Apex Legends. Topics are timestamped to get you the info you need. Some info will feel like a refresher, as this guide is for beginners to advanced users as it progresses. For advanced users, this is a helpful list of reminders for even myself as I was making this video. So let's start with the basics of Apex Legends and the level of engagements. In most Battle Royale settings, you have to deal with a large range of motion, long-range shots and long-range recoil control, mid-range openings, to intense close-range fights with movement. This means you will need to be able to have a sensitivity that can be comfortable at many ranges. Even pros miss this concept and overtrain a specific level engagement, focusing only at super close range, for example. Let us take from a prior sentence and highlight the most important word of this video: comfortable. This is your biggest goal and takeaway from today's video. This tip is important for all those looking up pro settings or exclamation point sensitivities in chat, or trying to find out anybody's sensitivity settings in general. Remember, most streamers, pros, or creators will say this is the best sensitivity, but we are all built differently, so your ideal sensitivity is going to be different. Longer or shorter arms, different hand sizes, anxiety or shaky hands, calm demeanor, or even various heights. Because your ergonomics are key to ensure over a long period of time you are not feeling uncomfortable and impacting yourself in a longer gaming session. So be sure to sit up straight, sit properly. It's going to impact your health in the long term. As a reminder, what works best for a pro may not work for you. Another tip is try to avoid copying pros, streamers, or creators. While this can be good to try what works for them, your goal is to find a sensitivity to maximize your potential. So I stress to keep an open mind. Now let's segue and highlight what the pros and cons of various sensitivity ranges are. Lower sensitivity pros: it's easier to have refined movement, can have historically smoother aim. Now the cons is that it can be harder to track faster moving targets. This is especially true for controller players dropping their sensitivity too slow. What you can do to improve this is have really good game sense to know where an opponent is going to be or potentially going to land. Now another con is you run out of mouse pad. Harder to react to changing speeds, and it can be very tough on your shoulders. Now let's discuss higher sensitivity settings. Let's discuss the pros first. You can have a faster reaction to flicks, easier to track target switching, and easier to also create a flow with your aim. Now the downside is it can be harder for those refined movement, those precision-based shots. If on controller, this is really applicable, especially at range. It can be harder to avoid shakiness. This is especially true when adrenaline kicks in, and can be tougher on your hands. Conclusion: you can find what fits best for you based on these pros and cons. Like we mentioned, each category may fit you differently, and finding that balance can be also very key. So let's segue to some exercises in the range to get you used to finding this sensitivity on controller, or MNK. We'll utilize some Aim Lab as well. The most common exercise that we see utilized by both MNK and controller players is being at close range. While close range can be beneficial to practice, this is just one category of aim, but it is important to train because you might have a sensitivity that is perhaps too slow. In this example, I'm definitely using a sensitivity that is overly slow at 0.44 at 1600 DPI, just for reference. While it does create a smooth track, even me tracking there, I do run out of mouse pad. Running out of mouse pad can be very key because you actually be able to need to lift your mouse. So fine tune and adjust based on being close range, and if you are running out of mouse pad, or even if you're on controller, if you feel like the movement just isn't cutting it. So now let's segue to the next exercise. Now being mid-range is probably one of the most important counters in Apex Legends, as this is going to create openings. I definitely recommend removing the barrel stabilizer, just as an FYI, because that does reduce your recoil in general. Now, in this exercise, you want to be more around mid-range. So if we're looking at the range here, we see this is about 60. So 60 to 100 is, I guess you could say, mid-range. And we're going to do the extreme and controlling recoil on our last exercise. Now this exercise, you can use various sights, but your goal is to just be able to track mid-range. That's your overall goal. Now you can change your sensitivity by increasing this or dropping this. Now, if you're on controller, or even on MNK, you can use a per optic sensitivity. I've utilized this before to match my 1x to my hipfire. This, if you're on controller, can be very beneficial, as sometimes 3x, 4x, 6x, and even 10x can be very difficult to control if you're on controller. But you can refine those by speeding them up. If you speed them up, it'll be much easier to control at a distance. Now, of course, as a gentle reminder, remember at close range, if you change those sensitivities, that you're going to lose that speed as well. So as we discussed speed, remember those variables are very important to control. So now let's go and segue to the next exercise. Remember, with barrel stabilizer removed, one of the most important things is to remember that refined movement. On controller, this is going to be a lot more difficult, but you can fine tune those per optic like we discussed. So the biggest thing is to be able to control that recoil pattern at a distance. Remember when we discussed the FOV that you can increase this or lower it. So at lower FOV, just so you get that visual reminder, it may seem like the recoil is a lot worse. But in reality, it is not. It is actually not changing whatsoever. If you increase the recoil, it may seem like it's less, but it is still the same recoil pattern and the same recoil. You just see less because the field of view or your cone of vision is different. Now understand that there's a lot of visual clutter in Apex Legends, and this can also impact this. So when we did our little checklist earlier, remember that that can also impact your decision, because being at a lower FOV can also, well, increase your chance of visual clutter, especially if there's a thermite near you. Overall, this is a fantastic exercise that I do recommend to fine-tune, to discover what setting is going to work best for you. This is probably one of the most common scenarios that you're going to be thrown into, which is somebody strafing in front of you, which is VT pill track. This is a great scenario to practice. Right now I'm using a lower sensitivity on a different mouse pad. I'm using the GSR Gris. Normally I utilize the Skypad. But changing different variables can be very impactful to finding that right sensitivity for you, whether it's good, whether it's bad. And then as you dial it in, maybe you need to increase your sensitivity to be able to react to this target, or maybe you need to lower it to have a more refined movement. That's up to you to discover. So let's discover some additional 2 scenarios that you can practice and find this refined movement as well. Now, in this example, I'm still utilizing a lower sensitivity just to showcase what happens when you run out of mouse pad. So I want to discuss that. You might have to lift. This is a larger range of motion. I'm pretty much at the bottom of my mouse pad right now. Unfortunately, while it creates a smoother track, it does concern when you start reaching uncomfortable areas. There you go, I'm off the mouse pad now. How it can feel, and maybe you might need to change your sensitivity so you don't have to lift as much. So with this sensitivity, at this point, I have to lift. And that's using a full, large mouse pad. Just to kind of give you a little context. So when you're using different scenarios like this, keep that in mind. So let's segue to another task that can be helpful when improving. I get asked a lot about how to improve your recoil control at a distance, and while there's different patterns, of course, memorizing those patterns can be very beneficial. This exercise can be very beneficial as well to getting used to that. So using a lower sensitivity, which is what we've been using this whole time, can really help you on those refined movements. If I was using too fast of a sensitivity, then this could also be very difficult. I would say when you really have mastered this, going for a score of, let's say, about 100,000 is going to be key. Now, I stopped shooting for a second. You'll notice that the target doesn't move. Maybe it's just placebo, but as you start getting into a flow is whenever you'll notice the target kind of bounces in pretty much a pattern. But as you get this pattern, you'll understand the movement that you need to control recoil. So just some little tips there. Now, the last one I'm going to highlight for all of you is SixShot Ultimate. Having a lower sense is going to help you in terms of hitting these targets, but it will have some stopping power instead of creating a flow like you like. So you got to find that balance between speed and dexterity. So if I was on my Skypad, which I'm not at the moment, I might be a little faster, but right now you can definitely see the stopping power of a cloth pad, and that being a variable as well changes things. And this can also be impactful for controller players when looking for a flow when trying to hit various targets, because your slowdown is also just as impactful. While I'm also precise, the downside is I'm also stopping quite a bit here. So finding a balance in what you're trying to achieve is very important. Maybe you prefer that precision and don't mind having being that slowdown effect. But if you're trying to hit multiple targets consistently at range, then you might need to adjust your settings. So always keep into account the various variables and where you excel and where you don't. This is a quick discussion of another variable which will require a more in-depth video, but because people know I have used this extensively, I want to discuss it. Acceleration. Now, acceleration for M&K or controller is the work to find the best of both worlds. It can be difficult to fine-tune though, because not all acceleration is the same. Let's understand this. Standard mouse acceleration can be overwhelming and is bad because of the wild curve that it has. Using curves from other software like raw acceleration, where you can dial in these settings, can be a lot more beneficial. Now, this is not recommended for most users as it's another variable in a wide set of settings. I recommend this after a fun option to train your aim if you've already played around with a large range of sensitivity settings. Leave a like and comment if you want a dedicated video on this topic, as it will require a lot more to break down. Now, let's discuss another factor that can impact your aim without you knowing it. Let's discuss FOV, centimeters/inches per 360, and what that means. At a higher FOV, it impacts your aim because it will make your aim feel slower because you are naturally seeing more around you. Now, it can be harder to see targets that are further away to refine your shot, but you can also see a lot more around you to hit targets, so there is that also plus. For lower FOV, the impact to aim can also make your sensitivity feel faster because your visual cone is much smaller. It can be easier to see targets further away, to be more precise, but the downside is you can see less around you, making target switching a lot more difficult. So if you find you are struggling close range, increase the FOV. If you struggle with long range, drop it down, or find a balance. Notably, Apex Legends for most pros feels comfortable at a max 110 FOV. I personally have either utilized 104 or 110. This will require a different video, which is DPI versus sensitivity. But understand though, if you spin a full 360, regardless of FOV, you'll end up in the same spot after doing a full 360. Another note is you can balance DPI and sensitivity to achieve the same 360. Now, I feel this is a big impact as well of how it feels, but is going to require a different video, so comment down below if you would like this video as well. Now, as you develop muscle control over your mouse or controller, it's important to document these changes. I do this extensively. Here's some recommendations. You can track trends on paper, your phone, or even in Excel. Remember that you have different areas in which you're going to improve, and there are different categories when it comes to aim. So on screen, I'm showcasing a bunch of these categories, and I'm going to put a link down below to a raw Excel sheet of these various categories, and I want you guys to take a look at them because you have different categories such as hitting static targets, dynamic targets, or hitting a react tracking, or just smooth tracking, or target switching. All of these are very important in terms of your area improvement. For Apex Legends, I'm going to highlight that some of the most important are going to be dynamic clicking as well as reactive tracking, and of course keeping a smooth track. That tends to be the more category that you're going to feel, but remember that aim overall to improve is that you have to improve different areas to improve as a whole. Your different sensitivities that we discussed are going to impact various levels of these categories. So I highly encourage that you try a different range of sensitivities based on these categories, and you're going to find that different sensitivities achieve different results. I have lots of these sheets, like I mentioned before, written down. And to be honest, I know my strengths and weaknesses based on various sensitivities. Now it's up to us to put the time in to improve. So let's segue to some in-game mechanics next. Now let us discuss some quick mechanics in the game that can adjust or change your decision on sensitivity, which is recoil smoothing and, of course, jitter aiming. Recoil smoothing, well, you see the recoil kicks pretty high. If you increase the speed of which you're moving without going up or down, you'll notice that the recoil seems significantly less compared to the initial recoil. This is what we call recoil smoothing. It is smoothing out your recoil if you're tracking somebody to not be as overwhelming needing to pull down. Now, there is another mechanic you can pair with this called jitter aiming. Jitter aiming is a mechanic where you're pretty much shaking your mouse and screen to beat the recoil pattern. I always recommend just learning the recoil pattern. This is a technique that can be helpful. And while I kind of do a bit of both because I understand the recoil pattern, let's say if the R301 kicks up to the right initially, I pull down to the left, and then I know the recoil pattern is only mostly horizontal at the end, and then of course you can jitter if you need to, just to kind of get it back on center. But you can try these techniques. They're not for everybody. At a lower sensitivity, it can be a little harder to jitter aim. If you're at a higher sensitivity or mid-range sensitivity, jitter aiming can be a lot easier. In this example, because I'm at such a lower sensitivity, me jiggling my arm around is not going to be as ideal and probably not going to feel as comfortable on my shoulder. The same thing can apply if you're using a fast sensitivity, and jittering your hand or aim too much can also be not as positive. So let's segue to our next discussion. Here's another major tip for both controller and MNK users. It is a setting where you change your aim to either toggle or hold. If you are aim training a lot, this might feel more comfortable just to have the toggle feature on so you don't have to think about the extra pressure whenever you are holding. If you're holding, that extra pressure can actually be beneficial to help you with your aim because you'll be holding your finger down to apply more pressure. Now this can add more dexterity, or this can increase the pressure to help either utilize jitter aiming or control the recoil, but it can also do the opposite effect. Now, just remember how that feels, because, holding feels that way, and of course, if you switch over to toggle, it may not be as fast as going in and out as well. So keep those pros and cons in mind when using hold versus toggle, and what's going to feel best for you. It does free up your hand if you're on controller to do a little bit more and be a little more creative, but it is another input that you have to press to get back to base. The same thing happens with M&K. So keep those in mind, test these features out because they do impact how you control recoil and your sensitivity. So if we're using toggle, you might actually lower your sensitivity because you don't have that needed pressure. And of course, if you need that pressure, holding can actually have an opposite factor of perhaps raising your sensitivity. Remember, these are more high-level tips, and while I give these tips, there's somebody out in the world that might have the opposite experience, but it is a variable to think about whenever you're controlling recoil or just trying to track a target that is close range. Here's another quick reminder when it comes to sensitivity, specifically when it comes to Apex Legends, is movement. Movement can be a very key component when it comes to Apex Legends, but running a too low of a sensitivity can also be impactful, especially when you're trying to look down for a super mantle jump or a super zipline jump. Sorry if I added the super twice in there. And of course, if you're even just trying to do a simple wall bounce, sometimes having too low of a sensitivity can help and pretty much create a flow. But having too fast of one can also help you do nice sporadic movement, especially whenever you're ziplining. So remember though, as I'm moving my mouse, is that I am running out of mouse pad fairly quickly. So if you happen to have a lower sensitivity and you have to reset your mouse and then start tracking somebody, what that can do as a positive and negative towards your aim. So keep that in mind, just a helpful reminder and tip whenever you're utilizing different sensitivities, as they are going to impact your overall range of motion like we discussed for inches and centimeters per 360. So as we wrap up, now you have these tools, understand how even after 6 months of aim settings and refining these changes, it's like painting. You develop your own style. This is your goal. You unfortunately won't ever aim like anyone else. And as you improve, your sensitivity settings are going to change and grow as well. So I hope this video is helpful to find your best sensitivity settings and encourage a range. And while this may take some time, I promise you that you'll have a much rewarding experience of finding your sensitivity and improving and finding what works best for you. Let me know in the comments what we can go more extensively in. This is definitely a tricky video because there's a lot to cover. I appreciate you guys watching. Don't forget to leave a like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys all in the next video.